I was in the Army for 2 years. I had gone to college for a couple of years. I wasn't doing well enough to continue. I mean, I wasn't failing, but it was just sort of a continuation of high school. So I left school, applied for the draft, and went to the Army for 2 years. I was stationed at during the height of Vietnam, 1968 to 70. I was stationed in New York, and then I was stationed in Germany. Came out of the military. I went back to college, finished my degree, and always wanted to work for the government. I started actually with GSA in Washington. And after about 10 years with GSA in Washington and in Philadelphia, I really decided I either wanted to leave the government or find a different agency. So I applied for a job in DOD, which happened to be here in Philadelphia at the Defense Industrial Supply Center. I was fortunate enough to get the job. So I began my career in DLA at the Defense Industrial Supply Center, DISC, in 1982. I was with DISC from 1982 until about 1993. I went from North Philadelphia, Defense Industrial Supply Center, to South Philadelphia, Defense Personnel Support Center. And I was with them until the BRAC decisions, which occurred, and put the two activities together back in North Philadelphia. From my time moving from DISC to DPSC, Defense Personnel Support Center, we became the Defense Supply Center of Philadelphia, and then eventually became the Defense DLA Troop Support. The DISC was really a hardware weapon system support activity. All of DLA is similar in the sense that the different activities support different commodities. The hardware centers, as they were known then, that's Columbus, Richmond, and Philadelphia, bought spare parts, mostly for weapon systems, used by the maintenance activities in the military services, the shipyards, the aircraft overhaul facilities, the big bases where maintenance activities take place. And then the rest of the other parts of DLA buy fuel or buy food, clothing, and medicine, as troop support does now. But they're all really commodity buyers. They just have oftentimes different customers, maybe in the same service, but two different customers. And they work in different market spaces. So they buy from different types of commercial activities. It changes their mission to some degree, but they're really supplying products to the military, wherever that might be. What was fascinating here in Philadelphia was the group of people who brought hardware, DISC, dealt with different customers than the group of people in Philadelphia that bought food, clothing, and medicine. And when those two came together, it was a real blend of cultures. It was a real blend of market spaces, a blend of different contracting activities. It was really fascinating. All because of that infamous BRAC and the decisions made by BRAC. DISC and DPSC joined together as a result of a BRAC decision, and the feeling was that you really couldn't justify having two separate facilities, two separate back offices, two separate command structures in the same town. So they brought the two together, even though the mission was significantly different. But DLA made some big changes elsewhere at the same time, which were kind of important. They shifted the hardware centers away from commodity buying to support of customers. During the first Gulf War, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, DISC did not have a big role. Most of the stuff that they bought was weapon system spare parts. And when you move troops into a given area, they typically have enough of that initial supply of spare parts that they travel with it. Whereas 2 years after Desert Shield, Desert Storm, I arrived in South Philadelphia to the Defense Personnel Support Center, and their mission was significantly impacted by the Desert Shield, Desert Storm operation, just as one example. The medical director in DPSC at the time held several $100 million worth of inventory in the warehouses, ready to deploy when something like Desert Shield, Desert Storm would occur. When all the troops were sent in the Middle East, they didn't requisition any of that material from the medical directorate. All the doctors, who were mostly reserve officers, doctors, they ordered all the stuff they were used to using in their private life. Medical realized that they no longer had a mission if they were buying their own packaged OD green medical supplies. That caused medical to shift to the prime vendor model. It was a huge change. Medical went from $800 million worth of medical supplies down to virtually less than 100 million in doing the same mission. And today, they do billions of dollars worth of work for multiple agencies with almost no supplies sitting in the depot. So the shift to commercial practices was really caused by Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Once medical got the initial program going, and they did it in the National Capital Region, food finally realized they could do the same thing. So I, as a soldier in 1978, 79, and 80, would sit at a mess hall eating cereal that was ugly in goofy packaging that was designed by the military. Subsistence realized that that sort of food supply was never going to last for the long term, particularly after medical was able to shift to the commercial practices. Subsistence then virtually did the same thing, to the point where I don't think there's any food left in the warehouses any longer. It's all bought from a commercial store. So the shift that Desert Shield, Desert Storm caused was really pretty significant. I don't think the shift to prime vendors was difficult for employees. What it really did more than anything else is the shift to prime vendors or to the use of the commercial supply chains. It reduced the workforce, but the workforce was really reduced by attrition. So the impact wasn't, I don't think, significant in the employees' minds. What was significant was, in Philadelphia was a perfect example of this. The people at DISC buying hardware from commercial manufacturers and weapon system support providers were buying things completely differently than the buyers of food, clothing, and medicine who had moved to commercial practices. So there was a sort of a difference in the way DLA approached things. Eventually, the hardware centers and the customer support centers began to do the same things. The big shift that came out of the Defense Industrial Supply Center was a shift from working in a functional silo, in a functional stovepipe, to working to our commodity-based, customer-based commodities business units, so that we put the functional people together and they started to work in a given commodity. So all the people that bought a certain type of hardware worked side by side with the supply representatives and the quality representatives for that same commodity. That shift really started the change from working purely in stovepipes, working purely within the one or another directorate, to working towards supporting the customer. They were called commodity business units back then. And it was enabled because there was a lot of collaboration between Richmond, Columbus, and Philadelphia, the DISC part of Philadelphia, back then, to move in that direction. And that's what eventually caused the shift to the customer-facing organizations that exist in the hardware centers today. The initiative really came because people working in stovepipes forgot why they were doing what they were doing. They wanted to be the perfect quality person or the perfect procurement person or the perfect supply person. And individually, those, if you don't collaborate between those functional specialties, then the customer doesn't get served. And I think probably what you see today is DLA focused more on the customer than we were back in 1982 when I started. Back when I started, we were focused on what was our job. what do we do at our desk? And we really didn't focus on the customer support part of that. But business systems modernization was a big change. I remember talking to the guys that had initially been part of the SAMS introduction back when. SAMS came in the 50s and 60s, and it lasted 20, 25 years. But as I was becoming a senior leader in DISC, SAMS was getting old. SAMS was getting tired. SAMS was no longer functional. So the move to BSM was really something that was absolutely necessary. The folks that I knew that had been part of the switch over to SAMS told me it was going to be rotten, hard, very difficult, but the change was absolutely necessary. And I think that DLA in the BSM change pulled off quite an accomplishment to get that system in place and working well. And it wasn't easy. There were a lot of changes that took place in the way people did work then, and that probably had more effect than all the other organizational changes. There was a push, and what I always found is initially the forward deployment was with the commodities of food, clothing, medicine, and fuel. That also then moved to the commodities of hardware, the very hardware centers, and then to disposition and distribution for that matter. But what I always found is that the people who, the folks really liked the opportunity to deploy and get close to the customer. So when we had a position that was open for deployment to Europe or even the Middle East, there was no lack of people who were willing and able to volunteer to take that job. And in fact, some people went over there and never wanted to come back. But as I said, it started with the commodities that are directly related to troops, food, clothing, and medicine, fuel, and then it's basically moved to all the other functions and support factors that DLA provides. When I first came to DISC, I was the deputy director of plans and policy, and it was a systems analysis, manpower management kind of a function, and it was the old the code was DISC L, and it was really sort of a centralized management analysis organization. The director at the time retired, or he actually had a bicycle accident riding to work, and retired as a result of that. And they offered me the opportunity to become the director, so I'm quite happy to do that. I moved from then to be the comptroller of Defense Industrial Supply Center. And it was during that time when a lot of changes were taking place, and the comptroller's organization was very involved with both the supply function and the procurement function. As comptroller, though, I got involved in an awful lot of things throughout the organization, and I found that job to be very rewarding. Big change that occurred when I was comptroller was the Department of Defense established the DBOF, Defense Business Operations Fund, now known as the Working Capital Fund. That was a very significant change because it changed the way DLA was funded. It changed the ability of DLA to make good decisions on how they bought product and how they managed the organization. It brought with it the dreaded word, the surcharge, which is now known as the cost recovery rate. But what it really did is it focused, the use of a cost recovery rate focused the customer on how much DLA costs them to do the work that they could otherwise do for themselves. And that made DLA focus real heavily on cost, on reducing the cost of doing business. So it was a significant change. It wasn't as hard to implement as you might have thought. There were pockets of resistance throughout the military, and in some cases, pockets of resistance in DLA, but it was largely accepted, and it really did benefit everybody because it forced DLA to prove the value of the work they did and what they brought to the customer. when the Marine Corps changed their uniforms, I was working as part of troop support, and the SES at Marine Corps Log Command called me up and said to me at one point, if we change our uniforms, is the price going to change? So I went back to the clothing and textiles folks and I asked that same question. And their best answer was probably not. So I went back to the Marine Corps and said probably not. So we took the new design, built the new uniform, generated had it manufactured and sent them to them, and the price changed. And at that point, the Marine Corps went ballistic because they couldn't justify that change. They felt they could do it by themselves without having to pay DLA surcharge, which means they would do all the procurement, they would do all the design, they would do all the quality assurance, etc. But it was a significant issue. The director called me up one day and said, George, what happened? And I went through that with him, and he was satisfied with that. But he had to go report back to OSD at the time, to one of the Assistant Secretaries of Defense. Her name was Diane Morales, and explained to her what had happened there. But Marine Corps was unhappy with the price of the uniform, despite what we tried to do to make it the same price as it had been before. But I was on the hot seat for a period of time for having worked through that. Eventually, they came back, and the issue is the big point of discussion between the military services and DLA typically is what does DLA do that they can't do for themselves, and does DLA do it cheaper? And if you consolidate or centralize the work, you typically can get it done in a better way by the practices than if you allow every individual service unit to do their own work. You don't duplicate as much as you would if you consolidate within DLA. I was the comptroller of DISC, and I was promoted to be the deputy commander of DISC. It was my first SES position, and that was in 1993. At that point, the BRAC decision was, the only BRAC decision was to close the clothing factory in South Philadelphia and to move that activity off that base, close that base, and move them onto this base. That was the BRAC decision. Soon after I became the deputy at DISC, the next BRAC decision was close DISC. So I moved to South Philadelphia, and the people at DISC thought I was abandoning the sinking ship because they'd been closed. And the people in South Philadelphia thought I was coming down there to bring all the jobs from the DISC people to DPSC. So there was a bit of tension between the units in Philadelphia until we were finally able to bring them together in 1999 on site in North Philadelphia. But there were times when there were real concerns on both parts that jobs were going to be affected. I was fortunate enough to work with a lot of directors sort of one-on-one. I had a lot of interaction with a lot of them. Just to pick out a few that particularly impressed me, Admiral Straw. Admiral Straw changed the way the agency worked. The agency was very headquarters-centered, headquarters-focused. Everything was top-down. And Admiral Straw really turned a lot of the old guard, old school, turned them around and made them think in different ways. In some cases, he made some of them move. In other cases, he made them so uncomfortable they may have left. But what he did do was he really empowered the subordinate activities, the field commands, to begin to act for themselves and develop some innovation. And it was Admiral Straw that was around when Prime Vendor started, which was one of the most significant things that occurred. I remember at one point he went to the contracting officer in subsistence and said, "So how soon can you put Prime Vendor in around the world?" And he did it during his tenure. So he was a very significant director. One of his proteges was Admiral Lippert. The two of them, between the two of them, they had more time in the director's chair than probably any other directors that I can remember. Admiral Lippert was perhaps the most professional, and his leadership style was very mild-mannered, but very direct. He understood exactly what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it, and he made it clear to who he was working with, and he did it in a way that you couldn't, it was hard to ever say no to Admiral Lippert, or hard to ever argue with him, because he knew what he was doing, he thought through things well in advance, and he was very well prepared for this job. And he led the agency during some of the most difficult times in the agency, to include many of the BRAC implementations. And then General Glisson. General Glisson had been he had been in Philadelphia when I was here, but he was in DPSC when I was in DISC. So I worked with him somewhat, and he was in DPSC when the clothing factory was shut down, and when some of the BRAC decisions were made. And he understood, before I did, he understood the implications of closing South Philadelphia, moving everyone into North Philadelphia. And he did his best to try to make that a smooth transition before he left. And then when he became the director of the agency, you know, he perhaps more than anyone around, he brought about the focus on the customer. So the development of deploying people overseas really began in earnest under him. The focus on talking to the customer and finding out what the customer wanted. So all the things we do today, the DLA Army days, the DLA Air Force days, those all began under General Glisson. So very, very, very strong leadership from those three. I don't know that I had really strong relationships with any of the others that I should bring up, but those three were really amongst the three that I thought were crucial to the agency's growth. So I stayed with DLA, and you know, I cannot imagine having to spend a better part of my career than the time I spent in DLA. And particularly after the merger of the two elements in Philadelphia. But why I stayed in DLA? Because it was well run. You had the opportunity to speak your piece and to apply innovation. You really had the opportunity to grow as an individual. And you, as I got in more leadership roles, the opportunity to help other people grow was there as well. I can't imagine a more rewarding career than my DLA career.